Before I marry you, tell them why you really asked me." The words cut through the ballroom like a quiet crack in glass. For a moment, no one spoke. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, reflecting soft gold across the marble floor of the Hayes Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. Cameras waited along the edges of the room, society reporters whispering behind notepads, guests dressed in tailored suits and silk gowns watching the young couple standing beneath a white floral arch. Adrian Hayes, 32, heir to the Hayes hospitality empire, stood perfectly still in a black tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Across from him, Riley Foster held the edge of her veil between two fingers, her expression calm but unyielding. The officiant cleared his throat softly, unsure whether to continue. Adrian had built a reputation for control. Investors trusted him, tabloids followed him, and board members respected the way he carried the Hayes name. Yet right now, with hundreds of eyes watching, control was the one thing slipping quietly through his fingers. Riley slowly lifted the veil off her head and placed it on the table beside the wedding contract. The motion was small, deliberate, almost gentle, but it felt louder than the music that had stopped mid-note. A murmur moved through the guests. Adrian looked at her, really looked at her, the same way he had the first night he met her 3 weeks earlier in a smoky private poker lounge on the top floor of a Las Vegas casino. That night had started as nothing more than arrogance wrapped in champagne and easy money. 5 men around a green felt table. A deck of cards. A careless challenge tossed into the air. Adrian had been winning for hours, stacking chips without even trying, when one of his friends leaned back in his chair and said with a grin, "You can buy anything in this city, Adrian, but I bet you can't make a girl like that marry you." Adrian had followed the direction of the man's nod. At the bar stood a woman in a worn leather jacket, arguing calmly with a security manager who looked twice her size. She wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, just firm in a way that made everyone around her uncomfortable. Her dark hair was tied loosely behind her neck, and there was something about the way she stood, steady, unafraid, that made her impossible to ignore. 48 hours, Adrian had replied, sliding 2 poker chips into the center of the table. Give me 48 hours. What he didn't expect was that when he walked across the room and offered Riley Foster a simple proposal. No romance, no promises, just a 1-year marriage agreement worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. She didn't laugh, didn't hesitate, didn't ask a single question. She looked at him for exactly 5 seconds, as if measuring something invisible, and then she said yes. That should have been the first warning. Now, standing under the bright lights of a wedding everyone believed was real, Riley folded her arms loosely and looked at Adrian with the same steady eyes she'd had in Vegas. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Tell them the truth." The silence in the room deepened. Adrian felt the weight of every camera lens and every whisper waiting for him to speak. And for the first time since that careless night in Vegas, he realized the bet he thought he had already won might actually be the beginning of the biggest mistake of his life. 3 weeks earlier, the desert air outside the Bellagio felt warm even after midnight, the kind of Las Vegas night where neon reflections shimmered across polished sidewalks and expensive cars idled along the curb. Inside a private poker lounge on the 42nd floor, Adrian Hayes leaned back in his leather chair while a dealer quietly shuffled another deck. The room smelled faintly of citrus cologne and polished wood. 5 men sat around the green table, each worth more money than most cities, and boredom had slowly replaced competition as the night stretched on. Adrian stacked his chips with casual precision, not even glancing down as he slid another winning hand forward. Someone poured him another glass of champagne. Another man laughed and shook his head. "You always win, Adrian. Hotels, casinos, investors, everything." Adrian smiled without much interest. Winning had become routine long ago. The Hayes family name opened doors before he even knocked. Yet the longer the night continued, the more restless the table became. Easy money never stayed interesting for long. One of the men across from him leaned back in his chair, watching the room beyond the glass wall of the lounge where music pulsed from the main casino floor below. Then he pointed casually toward the bar. "You see that girl?" Adrian followed his gaze. At the far end of the bar stood a young woman in a worn leather jacket and faded jeans, arguing calmly with a security manager who clearly wanted the situation to disappear quickly. She was not loud or dramatic. In fact, her voice stayed steady and controlled, which somehow made the moment more uncomfortable for everyone watching. Adrian noticed the way she refused to step back, the way her shoulders stayed square even when the guard tried to end the conversation. She is going to get herself thrown out, someone muttered. But the woman did not move. Adrian studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Something about her composure felt different from the usual Vegas chaos surrounding them. What about her? Adrian finally asked. The man beside him grinned and tapped the table with one finger. You think you can convince a woman like that to marry you? The table erupted with amused laughter. Adrian raised one eyebrow. Marry me. The man shrugged. You buy companies for breakfast. But that girl looks like the kind who would slam the door in your face. Adrian glanced back toward the bar again. The woman had finished speaking to the security manager and now stood quietly sipping water while the rest of the crowd returned to their drinks. She looked completely uninterested in the expensive room around her. Adrian felt something unfamiliar then, not attraction exactly, but curiosity. 48 hours, he said calmly, sliding 2 heavy poker chips into the center of the table. The laughter grew louder. You are serious? Someone asked. Adrian stood and adjusted the cuff of his jacket. Completely. The men watched him cross the room, their amusement following him like a shadow. Adrian stopped beside the bar and rested one hand lightly against the polished counter. The woman turned toward him slowly, her eyes sharp but unreadable. Up close, he noticed a small scar near her eyebrow and the steady confidence in her posture. My name is Adrian Hayes, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then said simply, Riley Foster. Adrian did not bother with small talk. I need a wife for 1 year, he said evenly. No romance. No expectations. Just a contract marriage. Riley stared at him as if trying to decide whether he was joking. Adrian continued before she could. Answer. You would receive more money than most people earn in a lifetime. 1 year of public appearances, and then we both walk away. The music from the casino floor thumped faintly through the walls. Riley's gaze never left his. 5 seconds passed. Then she gave the smallest nod. All right, she said. Adrian blinked once. That was fast. Riley picked up her glass of water and took a slow sip. You offered a deal, she said quietly. And I said yes. Adrian had expected negotiation, hesitation, maybe even laughter. What he had not expected was agreement. And as he watched Riley walk past him toward the elevator without another word, the first quiet question entered his mind. Why? The next morning the Las Vegas sun rose bright and relentless, pouring gold across the glass towers of the Strip as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. But inside a quiet conference suite on the 28th floor of the Bellagio, Adrian Hayes sat at the long polished table with a legal document spread neatly in front of him. Across from him, Riley Foster leaned back in her chair, arms loosely crossed, studying the room as if she had been inside places like this her entire life. The suite smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished marble. Outside the tall windows the city glittered, endless lights fading slowly into daylight. Adrian's attorney, a calm woman named Margaret Ellis who had handled Hayes' family contracts for almost 15 years, adjusted her glasses and began speaking in a steady voice. This agreement outlines a 12-month marriage arrangement between Mr. Adrian Hayes and Ms. Riley Foster. Both parties agree that the relationship is contractual and temporary. Riley did not interrupt. She simply listened, her expression neutral. Adrian watched her carefully. Most people reacted when Margaret listed the numbers involved in the financial clause. The figure alone was large enough to change a person's life forever. Yet Riley showed no excitement, no shock, no hesitation. She only nodded once as if confirming a detail she already understood. Margaret continued reading. Both parties will appear together at designated public events. Private living arrangements will remain separate. Personal financial accounts remain independent except for the agreed compensation provided to Ms. Foster. Adrian tapped one finger lightly against the table. There are also confidentiality terms, he added. The origin of this marriage stays private. Riley glanced at him for a brief second. Your reputation, she said calmly. Adrian shrugged slightly. Public perception matters. Margaret slid the contract across the table toward Riley along with a pen. You are welcome to review the full document before signing. Riley picked up the pen immediately. Adrian leaned forward a little, surprised by the speed of her movement. You are not going to read it? He asked. Riley looked at the pages for a moment, then back at him. You already explained the terms. Most people would take at least an hour, Adrian said. Riley gave the faintest smile, though it did not quite reach her eyes. Most people probably trust contracts less than they trust their own instincts. Adrian watched her carefully. And what do your instincts say? Riley lowered the pen to the paper. That 1 year is not very long. The quiet scratch of ink across paper filled the room. Margaret collected the signed document and placed it neatly into a folder. Then the agreement is official, she said. Adrian expected some kind of reaction from Riley after the final page was sealed. Relief. Curiosity. Something. But Riley simply stood from her chair and walked toward the window overlooking the bright Nevada skyline. For a moment, she rested both hands against the glass, staring out at the endless hotels stretching toward the desert horizon. Adrian joined her beside the window. You realize, he said quietly, most people would have asked for more. Riley turned her head slightly toward him. More money. Adrian nodded. Or more guarantees. Riley shook her head once. Money was not the difficult part. Adrian studied her face, noticing again the small scar near her eyebrow and the calm steadiness in her eyes. Then what was? Riley looked back out at the desert sunlight flooding the city streets below. For a second it seemed like she might answer. Instead she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small worn metal box no bigger than the palm of her hand. She turned it once between her fingers, then slipped it quietly back into her pocket. Just remember something, she said softly as she walked toward the door. Adrian frowned slightly. What is that? Riley paused with her hand on the handle. You were the one who offered the deal, she said without looking back. Do not be surprised by what comes with it. And before Adrian could ask another question, she stepped into the hallway and disappeared down the long marble corridor, leaving him alone in the silent conference room with a contract he thought he understood and a woman he clearly did not. 2 weeks later, the autumn wind moved softly across the Chicago River as a Blacktown car pulled up in front of the Hayes family penthouse tower overlooking Michigan Avenue. The building rose nearly 70 stories above the city, a wall of glass and steel reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. Riley Foster stepped out of the car first, her worn leather jacket still draped over her shoulders despite the elegant entrance surrounding her. The doorman held the glass doors open with polite confusion in his expression. Adrian Hayes followed a moment later, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored coat, while watching Riley scan the towering lobby ceiling as if measuring the place rather than admiring it. The marble floor gleamed under warm lighting and quiet piano music floated through the air. A concierge greeted Adrian immediately. Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes. Adrian nodded once. This is Riley. The concierge smiled politely. Welcome, Miss Foster. Riley returned the smile, but her eyes moved quickly across the room, observing the elevators, the security desk, the quiet conversations happening in the lounge area. Adrian noticed the way she studied every detail instead of reacting with excitement. Most first-time visitors stared at the building like it was a museum. Riley looked at it like a map. They stepped into the private elevator, and the doors closed with a soft chime. The car began rising smoothly toward the top floor. Riley leaned lightly against the wall, arms folded. 70 stories? She asked. Adrian nodded. Penthouse level. Riley tilted her head slightly. That seems excessive. Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. You will get used to it. The elevator doors opened into a quiet hallway lined with dark wood panels and soft recessed lighting. Adrian entered a code, and the penthouse door unlocked with a quiet click. The space inside stretched nearly the entire width of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the skyline of Chicago spreading for miles, the river winding between glass towers like a ribbon of light. Riley walked slowly into the living room, her boots making almost no sound against the polished oak floor. Adrian watched carefully, expecting the same reaction he had seen countless times before when people stepped into the penthouse for the first time. Surprise. Oh, excitement. Riley simply looked around once, then set her small travel bag beside the couch. So this is where the contract lives, she said calmly. Adrian leaned against the kitchen counter. You do not seem impressed. Riley shrugged lightly. It is a building. Adrian laughed quietly under his breath. A building that costs more than most neighborhoods. Riley glanced out the window at the city below. Traffic crawled along the streets like slow-moving lines of light. Still just a building. Adrian studied her for a moment. Your room is down the hall, he said finally. We keep separate spaces here. Riley nodded once. That was in the agreement. Adrian walked toward the hallway and opened a door to a guest suite overlooking the river. The room was larger than many apartments, with a wide bed, a sitting area, and another wall of glass framing the skyline. Riley stepped inside and set her bag on the chair. She looked around quietly for a moment before turning back toward Adrian. You have cameras in the common areas? She asked. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Security cameras, yes. Riley nodded thoughtfully, as if confirming something to herself. Good. Adrian frowned slightly. Good. Riley walked toward the window and looked down at the busy city far below. Places with too much money usually have too many secrets, she said quietly. Adrian crossed his arms. You think I am hiding something? Riley glanced back at him with a small, unreadable smile. I think everyone is. For a moment the room felt strangely quiet despite the enormous city humming beneath them. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but Riley had already turned back toward the window. In the reflection of the glass, he could see her reach into the pocket of her jacket again, touching the small metal box she carried before letting her hand fall back to her side. Adrian watched the reflection carefully. Whatever Riley Foster had agreed to when she signed that contract, it was becoming increasingly clear that she had walked into this arrangement with a plan of her own. The first public appearance happened 4 days later on a cool Chicago evening when the lights of the Hayes Foundation Gala illuminated the grand ballroom of the Lakeshore Regency Hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung high above round tables covered in white linen while a soft orchestra played near the stage. The event gathered investors, charity partners, and members of Chicago society who followed the Hayes family name as closely as financial news. Cameras flashed as Adrian Hayes entered the ballroom, with Riley Foster walking beside him. She wore a simple black dress chosen by the stylist Adrian had insisted she meet earlier that afternoon. The dress was elegant but understated, nothing like the elaborate gowns many of the other guests wore. Riley had agreed to wear it only after making one condition clear. No diamonds, she had said calmly while the stylist held out a velvet tray of jewelry. Adrian had watched her through the mirror. Why not? Riley had shrugged lightly. They do not belong to me. Now as they stepped onto the carpeted entrance platform, several photographers lifted their cameras. Adrian placed one hand gently at Riley's back in the way couples practiced for public events. Riley did not lean closer. She simply stood beside him, steady and composed. A reporter called out from the edge of the room. Mr. Hayes, is it true you were secretly married last week? Adrian gave the calm half-smile he had perfected during years of public appearances. Riley and I prefer to keep our personal life private, he replied smoothly. Riley glanced briefly toward the reporter, but said nothing. They continued inside the ballroom, where quiet conversations paused as guests turned to look at them. Adrian could almost hear the speculation moving across the room like a ripple through water. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had the heir to the Hayes fortune married someone no one recognized? At their table near the center of the room, several board members stood to greet them. One older investor named Charles Whitmore studied Riley carefully before extending a polite handshake. Mrs. Hayes, he said slowly. Riley shook his hand with calm confidence. Riley is fine. Whitmore smiled thinly. Of course. Throughout the dinner, Adrian watched Riley closely. He expected mistakes. Social missteps. Signs that she felt out of place in a room filled with people who had spent their entire lives inside wealth and power. Instead, Riley moved through the evening quietly observant, speaking only when necessary, answering questions with simple honesty that made some guests uncomfortable. At one point, a nervous young server carrying a tray of sparkling water nearly dropped several glasses while trying to navigate between chairs. Riley reached out instantly and steadied the tray before the glasses could slide. Take your time, she told him gently. No one here is in a race. The young man nodded gratefully before continuing. Adrian noticed the small moment, but said nothing. Later during the charity auction, Whitmore leaned closer to Adrian and spoke under his breath. You surprised the entire board with this marriage. Adrian kept his eyes on the stage. That was not the intention. Whitmore gave a soft chuckle. Still, one wonders what convinced Miss Foster to say yes so quickly. Riley heard the comment clearly. Instead of reacting with embarrassment, She turned slightly toward Whitmore. Opportunity, she said calmly. The older man raised an eyebrow. Opportunity. Riley nodded once. Sometimes life offers a door. You just have to decide whether to walk through it. Whitmore studied her for a long moment before looking back toward the stage. Adrian felt a strange shift in the atmosphere around the table. Riley had not defended herself. She had not tried to impress anyone either. She had simply answered with the same quiet certainty Adrian had first noticed in Las Vegas. As the auction ended and applause filled the room, Adrian leaned slightly closer to her. You handled that well, he said quietly. Riley looked toward the stage lights reflecting across the ballroom ceiling. People assume things when they see money, she replied softly. Adrian studied her expression. And what did you assume when you met me? Riley turned her head just enough for their eyes to meet. For a brief second something unreadable flickered across her face. Then she looked away again toward the crowd. That depends, she said quietly, on whether you plan to keep your promises. Adrian frowned slightly. Which promises? Riley did not answer. Instead, she rose from her chair as the audience stood for the final announcement of the evening. Across the ballroom, Adrian noticed something else. Riley's hand had slipped briefly into the pocket of her jacket again, touching the small metal box she carried as if reminding herself why she had walked through the door in the first place. The night after the gala, the Chicago skyline shimmered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hayes penthouse, while the city traffic far below hummed like a distant tide. Adrian Hayes stepped out of his office a little after 11:30 in the evening, loosening the collar of his shirt after finishing a long video call with investors in New York. The apartment was mostly quiet except for the faint sound of the refrigerator motor and the occasional rush of wind against the glass 70 floors above Michigan Avenue. As he walked toward the kitchen, he noticed a dim light glowing down the hallway that led to the guest suites. Riley's door was closed earlier when he passed by hours before. Now it stood slightly open, and a thin line of warm light stretched across the hardwood floor. Adrian paused for a moment before continuing down the hall. He had not intended to check on her. Their arrangement was clear. Separate lives inside the same walls. But something about the quiet glow of that light made him curious. When he reached the doorway, he noticed Riley sitting on the floor beside the low table near the window. She had changed into a simple gray sweater and jeans, and her hair was loosely tied back. The room lights were dim except for a small lamp beside her. In her hands, she held the small metal box Adrian had seen her carry since the day they met. For a moment, she did not notice him standing there. She slowly opened the lid and looked inside with an expression Adrian had never seen on her face before. The calm confidence she carried everywhere else seemed to soften into something quieter, something almost fragile. Adrian knocked gently against the doorframe so he would not startle her. Riley looked up quickly and closed the lid of the box in the same motion. You move quietly for someone who owns half the building, she said. Adrian leaned against the doorway. I did not mean to interrupt. Riley rested the box in her lap, but did not hide it. You are not interrupting. Adrian glanced toward the window where the Chicago River reflected the lights of passing boats. Long night. Riley nodded once. Something like that. Adrian hesitated before asking the question that had been sitting in his mind since Las Vegas. You said money was not the difficult part of this deal. Riley traced one finger across the edge of the metal box, but did not open it again. It still is. Not. Adrian stepped a little farther into the room. Then why agree so fast? Riley gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but without humor. Because sometimes life gives you exactly one door. Adrian crossed his arms. And you decided to walk through mine. Riley looked up at him then, her eyes reflecting the soft lamp light. You offered it. Adrian studied her carefully. What is in the box? Riley considered the question for a moment. Then she opened the lid again and turned it slightly so he could see inside. Adrian stepped closer. Inside the box were several folded documents, a small photograph of a young girl smiling in front of what looked like a school building, and a thin stack of medical bills held together with a paper clip. Adrian did not say anything for several seconds. Riley closed the lid again slowly. My sister, she said quietly. Adrian frowned slightly. You have a sister? Riley nodded. Emma. She is 10. Adrian looked at the box again. And those bills? Riley rested both hands over the lid. Hospitals are expensive in the United States. Adrian felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. You married me to pay for that. Riley shook her head slowly. Not exactly. Adrian waited. Riley looked toward the city lights outside the window before speaking again. I married you because time was running out. The words hung quietly in the room between them. Adrian realized then that the confident woman who stood beside him at galas and charity events had walked into this strange marriage carrying something far heavier than curiosity or opportunity. And for the first time since the night in Las Vegas, he began to understand that the contract he believed he controlled might have been written by circumstances neither of them had fully explained. The following morning, Chicago woke under a pale gray sky and the steady rhythm of weekday traffic filling the streets below the Hayes Tower. Adrian Hayes arrived at his office on the 49th floor of Hayes Hospitality headquarters a little before 9 in the morning, expecting the usual routine of board reports and investment briefings. Instead, he walked into a room that felt strangely tense. Several senior advisors stood near the conference table whispering quietly, while a large television screen displayed a business news broadcast. Adrian slowed his steps. The headline across the bottom of the screen read in bold letters, "Unexpected Marriage of Chicago Hotel Heir Sparks Questions Inside Hayes Board." Adrian set his briefcase on the table and picked up the remote. The reporter continued speaking with polished curiosity. Sources close to the Hayes corporate board say several investors were surprised by Adrian Hayes' sudden marriage to Riley Foster, a woman with no known business or social connections to the Hayes family network. Adrian muted the television. Charles Whitmore, the same board member from the charity gala, cleared his throat from across the room. Adrian, perhaps you should explain this situation before the quarterly meeting begins. Adrian leaned against the table calmly. There is nothing to explain. Whitmore folded his hands. Your marriage was never discussed with the board. Adrian's voice stayed even. My personal life does not require board approval. Whitmore exchanged a look with two other investors. When personal decisions affect public reputation, the board takes interest. Adrian was about to answer when his assistant Claire stepped quietly into the room, holding a tablet. Her expression carried the careful politeness of someone delivering uncomfortable news. Sir, she said softly, there is another issue. Adrian glanced at the screen she handed him. An online article from a Las Vegas lifestyle site had appeared overnight. The headline was smaller, but far more dangerous. High-stakes wedding? Rumors suggest Vegas bet behind surprise Hayes marriage. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Whitmore leaned closer to read the headline. A bet, he said slowly. Surely that is not accurate. Adrian said nothing for several seconds. The quiet in the room thickened. Whitmore straightened his posture. Adrian, if there is even a small chance this rumor has truth behind it, the consequences could damage the company. Adrian finally looked up. It was a private conversation among friends. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. So the story is not entirely false. Adrian exhaled slowly. It is not the story they think it is. Whitmore shook his head once. Public perception rarely waits for full explanations. At that moment, Adrian's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen and saw Riley's name. He stepped away from the table before answering. Adrian, Riley's voice said quietly through the phone. You should come home. Adrian frowned. What happened? Riley hesitated for a moment before replying. Someone sent an article to the hospital this morning. Adrian felt a sudden tension tighten across his chest. The hospital? Riley's voice stayed calm, but softer than he had ever heard it before. Emma's nurse asked if the story was true. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Across the room, Whitmore and the other board members watched him carefully. I am leaving the office, Adrian said firmly. When he ended the call, he looked back at the silent conference room. Whitmore spoke first. If this rumor spreads further, your marriage will become a public spectacle. Adrian picked up his briefcase again. Then we will correct the story. Whitmore studied him carefully. For your sake, he said quietly, I hope the truth is better than the rumor. Adrian walked toward the elevator without answering. As the doors closed and the elevator began descending toward the street, one thought repeated steadily in his mind. The bet that had once seemed harmless inside a Las Vegas poker lounge was now moving through the real world like a shadow neither he nor Riley could easily escape. Adrian Hayes arrived at the hospital just after noon, the cold Chicago wind pushing against the glass entrance doors as he stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh coffee from a small kiosk near the elevators. Families sat quietly in rows of chairs, some staring at their phones. others watching the television mounted high on the wall, where muted news headlines scrolled endlessly across the screen. Adrian moved quickly toward the reception desk, but slowed when he spotted Riley standing near the windows at the far end of the waiting area. She had her arms folded tightly across her chest, her leather jacket pulled close as if the building were colder than it really was. For the first time since he had met her, Riley looked uncertain. When she saw him approaching, she gave a small nod, but did not smile. Adrian stopped a few feet away. "How is Emma?" he asked quietly. Riley glanced toward the hallway that led to the pediatric wing. "She is resting. The nurse said the medication helped this morning." Adrian noticed the small metal box in Riley's hand again, her fingers wrapped around it, as if it were something fragile. "What happened with the article?" he asked. Riley exhaled slowly. "Someone sent it to the hospital staff email. Probably a journalist hoping someone would confirm it." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. "And Emma's nurse asked about it?" Riley nodded. "She did not mean any harm. She just said she hoped the story about a marriage bet was not true." The words hung between them. Adrian looked toward the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I never intended for that rumor to reach here." Riley studied his face carefully. "But it is not exactly a rumor, is it?" Adrian did not answer immediately. The quiet of the waiting room seemed to grow heavier with every second. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "It started as a bet." Riley's eyes closed briefly as if she had already expected that answer. "I thought so." Adrian took a slow breath. "But that was before I knew anything about you or Emma." Riley looked back toward the hallway again, where a nurse walked past pushing a cart of medical supplies. "The problem with public stories," she said quietly, "is that they never include the full truth." Adrian stepped closer. "Then we tell the truth." Riley shook her head gently. "That will not change what people already believe." Adrian watched her for a long moment before speaking again. "You told me time was running out for Emma." Riley nodded. Adrian straightened his posture as if making a decision. "Then that is the only thing that matters." Riley frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Adrian reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his phone. "The Hayes Foundation has a pediatric medical fund. It was created for cases exactly like this." Riley stared at him in silence. Adrian continued, speaking calmly. "It can cover the full treatment costs, the specialists, everything Emma needs." Riley's expression changed instantly. "No," Adrian blinked. "No." Riley's voice remained steady but firm. "I did not marry you to ask for charity." Adrian lowered the phone slowly. "It is not charity." Riley shook her head again. "It is still your money." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of a heart monitor beeped somewhere down the hallway. Adrian looked at Riley carefully, realizing the same quiet strength that had drawn his curiosity in Las Vegas was now the very thing standing between her and the help she needed. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Then let us make it something else." Riley crossed her arms again. "Something else?" Adrian nodded slowly. "A promise." Riley studied him carefully, the tension in her expression easing only slightly. "You have already made one promise," she said quietly. Adrian met her eyes without hesitation. "Then this time I intend to keep it." Riley did not answer right away. She simply looked down at the small metal box in her hands before lifting her gaze back toward him. For the first time since the news article appeared that morning, the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like a moment standing at the edge of something neither of them had expected when a simple bet had started everything. 3 months later, the first warm breeze of spring moved gently through the open windows of the pediatric wing at Lakeside Children's Hospital. Sunlight spilled across the polished floor and painted soft gold patterns along the walls where drawings from young patients hung in bright crooked rows. Riley Foster stood beside the hospital bed, watching her sister Emma laugh quietly with a nurse who was helping adjust a small stack of pillows behind her back. Emma looked stronger now, her cheeks carrying color that had not been there during those long nights earlier in the winter. The machines beside her bed hummed softly, steady and reassuring. Riley held the familiar metal box in her hands, the edges worn from months of being carried everywhere. Inside the box, the stack of hospital bills had grown smaller one by one as the treatments progressed. Some had been covered by insurance, some by Riley's own savings, and some, despite her protests, had quietly disappeared after Adrian Hayes had found a way to arrange anonymous support through the foundation without ever attaching his name to it. Riley had argued at first, Adrian had simply said one sentence that ended the argument. A promise does not need credit. Now Riley watched Emma smile at something the nurse said and felt a weight lift from her chest that she had carried for nearly a year. A soft knock came from the doorway. Adrian stepped into the room holding a small paper bag from the coffee shop across the street. He wore a simple navy coat instead of his usual business suit, and his hair moved slightly in the breeze from the hallway window. Emma brightened immediately when she saw him. "You brought the cinnamon muffins again," she said happily. Adrian smiled and set the bag on the table beside her bed. "Doctor's orders," he replied lightly. Riley watched the exchange quietly. Over the past months, Adrian had visited the hospital often, sometimes bringing books, sometimes simply sitting beside Emma while Riley met with doctors or filled out paperwork. The man who had once spoken about their marriage like a transaction now moved through the hospital corridors with a patience Riley had never expected. After the nurse finished checking Emma's chart, she gave Riley a warm nod. "The test results this morning looked good. Emma can go home later this week." The words seemed to pause the entire room. Emma clapped her hands softly while Riley pressed one hand over her mouth in disbelief. Adrian looked toward the window where sunlight filled the space and allowed himself a quiet breath. Later that afternoon, Riley and Adrian stepped outside the hospital entrance while Emma rested upstairs. The Chicago River breeze carried the smell of fresh rain across the sidewalk. Riley turned the small metal box slowly in her hands before opening it one last time. Inside remained only the photograph of Emma smiling in front of her school building. Riley removed the picture and held it for a moment before closing the box again. Then she placed the box gently into Adrian's hands. Adrian looked at her with confusion. "What is this for?" Riley gave a small, thoughtful smile. "You asked once what was in the box." Adrian nodded. Riley looked toward the hospital windows where Emma's room waited above them. "It was the reason I walked through your door." Adrian studied the box quietly. "And now?" Riley took a slow breath and met his eyes. "Now the reason is gone." Adrian hesitated before answering. "Does that mean the contract is finished?" Riley considered the question carefully. The city traffic moved past them, and somewhere down the block a street musician played a soft melody on an old guitar. Riley finally shook her head. The contract was never the important part. Adrian felt the weight of the small box in his hands. Then what was? Riley stepped a little closer and gently took the photograph from his fingers. "The promise," she said softly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before smiling in a way he had not done since the night everything began in Las Vegas. And standing there on a quiet Chicago sidewalk, neither of them mentioned the bet that started it all, because both of them finally understood that the only thing that mattered now was the promise they had chosen to keep.